I want to share with you a story that my grandmother would tell me when I was little. I called her Dadima, and Dadima knew how to make stories come alive. This one was about her when she was little, about as old as I was at the time, hiding under the bed and eating the mangoes that had been freshly delivered from the farms. Now, this was over a century ago when there were no refrigerators, so the mangoes would be soaked in buckets of water to take out the heat, and then they would be stored carefully away under the beds to keep them cool. Now, Dadima would tell me that she would get under the beds. She would find the biggest mangoes that were usually kept for the elders in the house. She would squeeze them with her little fingers until they were soft and easy to eat, and then she would eat them to her heart's desire. I was always fascinated by this story because it delighted the little kid in me. That's me and Dadima. I would snuggle up to her, I would look into her wrinkled face, and I would try and find that little girl I could relate with. And it was this connection that made me feel every moment of that story. The delight with which she would crouch under the beds in front of the mango-filled buckets, the dread with which she would listen for the sound of footsteps down the hallway, the physical agony of a mango binge, and the longing with which she would wait for her mother to come and soothe it. And that unnamed anguish she would experience as she lay awake in bed at night, knowing that she'd done the wrong thing. As I would share this story alongside Dadima, I would eventually fall asleep and dream of a world where Dadima and I would become one. And that can sometimes happen in dreams. Dadima had other stories too. There were stories of my grandfather in the war, or of her mother raising 3 orphan kids along with her own 9. There were stories of family being let down by the very people they had supported in their times of need. These were stories of human frailty and human goodness. There were stories of generosity, of kindness, of forgiveness, of courage. There were also stories of jealousy, of malice, of greed. But they all had one thing in common. They sparked the imagination, and they built empathy with people never known. And even though they were told without a purpose, they embedded values deep into the core, and they ignited the human desire to be good. We don't tell these kinds of stories anymore. We're either too busy or too tired to tell stories to children who have little interest in a past they'll never know. Or we pick and choose our best stories and we save them for those teachable moments, fleeting little subchapters from a much richer narrative. Without coherence, these stories are lifeless, and they fail to sink into the subconscious minds where most decisions are made. And without the wholeness of good and bad, they do little to build empathy, because few of us can relate to exemplars of human perfection. Our biased and untold stories harm not just our children, but also us as adults. In the dizzying pace of the world that we live in, we're fast losing connection with the past that feels increasingly irrelevant and distant to our lives. And I believe that this disconnect is at least part of the reason that many of us struggle to take the perspective of others, even though it is perhaps the greatest need of a world that has become more interconnected than ever before. The kind of perspective that we are building in our homes, schools, and organizations is purely cognitive in nature, a skill that many of us may have grasped, but not always embodied, and this comes at a price. I have spent many years researching the psychological construct of self-worth, and here's what I've found: that the ability to take the perspective of others without emotional empathy can be a dangerous thing. It leads to a sense of moral superiority, of judgment, and even contempt. It traps us in the tyranny of wanting to be right over trying to understand, and I think Many of us have experienced that. At best, it makes us weigh the pros and cons of our decisions as though others were objects and not humans with a soul. At worst, it ignites Machiavellian intentions and pursuits that can harm others and bring out the worst of our human instincts. I have also found that the ability to take the perspective of others without being grounded in our own sense of self-worth leads to unexpressed autonomy, a yo-yoing sense of right and wrong, and an inability to take a stand for what we want and what we need. We become hooked onto approval, a constant need for validation, and a dependence on others to feel good about ourselves. Way too many of us give preference to what's accepted over what's right, and silence the lives that long to live within each one of us. Either way, we stay stuck in the adolescence of our lives at a time when our humanity as a whole is shifting from its adolescence to its adulthood. These are the changing currents of our time. We are pushing the edges of the information economy to enter what's been called the purpose economy, where the need for growth, for connection, for belonging to something much larger than ourselves is our driving force. Not many of us are ready to rise up to this need, given an epidemic of emptiness and purposelessness that marks our times. And believe me, I see a lot of that in my work as a positive psychology coach. The wonderful author Marianne Williamson has said that it's sad when a child doesn't get to experience their childhood, but it's also sad when an adult doesn't really get to grow up. I believe that stories of our past can help us grow up. They instill a sense of belonging that lies at the heart of being human. They build perspective from a place of empathy for others and connection with ourselves, and not of selfish interests nor harmful selflessness. They expand our visions and allow us to hold on to multiple perspectives at the same time, a key marker of rising human consciousness. They allow us to be curious, to ask questions, to visualize how things were, which helps us imagine how things can be, because this wonderful brain cannot tell the difference between what's real and what's imagined. And this can help us take responsibility for our actions today, so we ensure a better tomorrow for those around us and for those who come after us in the many generations to come. Stories of our past can help us become the adults that we're waiting for. I'd like to leave you with this. We're all sitting atop a rich past, our own and that of the generations before us. You owe it to yourself and to your children to find your stories, stories of mischief and mirth, of values of valor, stories of success and beauty amid struggle and grief, a tango of sadness and joy that ultimately gives life the timeless coherence of meaning and wholeness. And when you do, to spin them into magical tales and to tell them in those calmer moments when the brain is actually looking to belong to something much larger than ourselves. Thank you.